Great. Well, thank you. I'm really grateful to be here. See a lot of familiar names. Good to see RJ and Dell and Freddie. Thanks, Freddie, for connecting us. So I am a talker, so I'm going to need you, Paula, to make sure that I follow the time. I did do a few slides that are really only for flow to help me kind of make sure that I manage my time well. So I will share a little bit and kind of go back and forth with you, just in terms of wanting to share the work of the Human Rights Commission with connectivity to the idea and notion of reparations and just the different projects that we have that are really focused on community give back, community engagement, but also the work that's focused on supporting the Black community. And so the San Francisco Human Rights Commission really works to address causes and problems resulting from prejudice, intolerance, bigotry, and discrimination, and really focused on bias. Recently, I was able to find a 1964 report. And so it is done, looks like on a typewriter and probably done, photocopied copied on the mimeograph, the old school for folks who remember that, the thing where you had to kind of crank it out. And so a 1964 report to the mayor, this statement really caught me. It says, San Francisco, like all American cities, is caught up in the resolution of Negroes to achieve their legitimate and undeniable goals of integration and equality in American life. So ultimately, this report in 1964, the mayor at that time convened what he called the Human Relations Program. And really their focus was to try and make sure that San Francisco didn't erupt in civil unrest or riots like were happening in other parts of the country. So this report is given. He, calls it out in the first paragraph, says that, San Francisco, just like everywhere else, is really wrestling with how to treat and support and address the challenges of the Black community and the frustration. That report recommended a citizens council to develop programs for a better employment, housing, and education for Negroes and other minority groups. So basically that citizens council was the Human Rights Commission. So the recommendation that came from this human relations program was that they create a citizens council, which was focused on developing better programs for employment, housing, and education for Negroes and other minority groups, which ultimately would become the Human Rights Commission. And so where we are today, for those who don't know, I started my career as a kindergarten teacher working in private schools. So I'm often still kind of back in those, how do I make this fun and interesting, even if it's only for myself? So folks might be going, what's with these graphics? So ultimately, there are several divisions in the Human Rights Commission. The three main ones we have are our Community Engagement Division, which supports a lot of the work that deals with reparations or outreach and engagement, or my Brother and Sisters Keeper initiative, or our paid internships. The Civil Rights Division, which is where where folks can go if they want to file a complaint that says that they have been discriminated against in housing, employment, or accommodations. And so accommodations are if you go into a public space and they refuse service to you or refuse to give you access because of a protected class, which might be gender, sexual orientation, height, weight, race, those 22 protected classes in San Francisco, and legislative affairs, which is where we are doing a lot of policy work and things of that nature. And so those are kind of the big areas that are in the Human Rights Commission. And then within that, we have other programs and initiatives within that, which one is SHARP, our Office of Sexual Harassment Awareness Response Prevention Office, the Opportunities for All paid internships, our LGBT Advisory Committee, and our My Brother and Sisters Keeper initiative. So those are just a few of the programs and initiatives that we have, but that live in the program there. And then some other ones that are very specific, and some of what you all have wanted the conversation around today, and I'll get back to where Paula can ask some questions. One is the Dreamkeeper initiative, which I'll say a little bit more about the Reparations Advisory Committee, the Office of Racial Equity, and our weekly kind of community roundtable. Those are groups that I think all intersect with this question around reparations and what we're doing, and then really looking at the cultural and racial groups within the city. And so those are some of those very specific programs that we have. So the Office of Racial Equity was launched in 2019 with a focus on transforming the systems and really looking at how the city addresses issues and the impact that the city has with regards to racial equity. And so with a focus on BIPOC folks, that is really the work of that office. There are 52 equity action plans, 52 departments submitted those and talked about how they are considering and addressing racial equity with their budget and with the work of that department. The Dreamkeeper Initiative, which is, this year, $120 million that's been invested, that is in several different departments in the city, which is focused on improving outcomes for the Black community. And it's both with education and economics, but also how we help folks feel seen, feel valued, and to experience joy. And so the Dreamkeeper Initiative is based off of several different poems, but there's a collection of poems by Langston Hughes called The Dreamkeeper. And one of my favorite poems is that from Hughes, and it says, "What happens to a dream deferred? Does it dry up like a raisin in the sun, or fester like a sore and then run?" And so the poem just goes on to really help folks understand the challenges and the issues with what happens when the dream is not realized. And so this is an opportunity for us to not just keep the dream, but to make the dream a reality through this funding and allocation of resources from Mayor Breed and President of the Board of Supervisors, Shimon Walton. And then we have a weekly convening of diverse stakeholders that convene every Friday from 11 to 12. And, folks are interested, I can definitely share the email address if you'd like to be engaged and participate. But we have a lot of partners from around the city, as well as different racial, ethnic groups that participate to talk about how do we partner, how do we advance strategies that really address inequity and improve outcomes across stakeholder groups. And so that group meets regularly. And then the Reparations Advisory Committee. And so that committee was launched, and we had a meeting actually just last night, and that committee is really thinking about and looking at and providing recommendations to the mayor, the Board of Supervisors, as well as the Human Rights Commission around adopting and implementing a plan for reparations in San Francisco. And so that group is focused on what reparations could look like. Is that about cash transfers? Is that about paying for college tuition for all Black students? Is that about housing and home ownership? They're really looking at what the redress can look like in terms of the harm that's been done to Black folks and what that investment looks like. And then they also are charged with making recommendations for the scope, like who's eligible and how long are they eligible, and is it a one-time amount that they get, or is it a lifetime amount of monthly guaranteed income? So really that body is exploring and considering what reparations could look like in the city and county of San Francisco. And so that is kind of the quick and dirty of this, but just wanted to kind of give that framing that there's the Dreamkeeper Initiative, which is already an allocation of $120 million for this fiscal year, $60 million annually after that, specifically to support the Black community. And then there is an additional conversation around reparations and recommendations that will be coming out. And so there is a report. The first report of the Reparations Advisory Committee is due in December of this year, and then another report will be due a year after that, so next December, to say what the recommendations are, and then that final recommendation, that final reparations plan is due 2 years from 2 years from June. So so in 2024, no, 2023. So the reparations plan is due in 2023, but there are drafts due at 6 months and 18 months. So December is when the first kind of report is due, and then next December 2022, the next report is due, and then 2023, the final reparations plan is due to the Board of Supervisors and folks. So I know I've unloaded a lot there, Paula. I don't know if you want to go, if you have questions, or you want me to hit on some other things there. When you're muted.
Thank you very much. I wonder if we could start with how people were chosen to sit on the committee, and a little bit of the breakdown. I know it's a lot because there's, I think it's 15 people who are seated on the committee, but I think there's some key highlights about how folks were chosen and how they applied.
So yes, there were 15 seats, and I'm going to pull up, I can probably share the link to the advisory committee, which spells that out. But yes, there are 15 seats. And so it ranged from a young person to an elder to faith-based to business owner, to folks that were someone that was formerly homeless. So there were a lot of different things in that regard. So let me pull that up as we're continuing to talk, and I can share that link with folks.
Okay. And as Commissioner Davis is doing that, if you have questions that have been burning, whether they be about reparations or the specific setup of this committee, please do start to populate the chat, and we'll make sure to get your questions answered.
And so, yeah, the seats are, there was an application process. And so the folks that were selected had to fill out an application, and then they had to go before the Board of Supervisors and speak and kind of make the case for why they wanted to be chosen and sit on the committee.
Okay. And then within the committee, as you are putting that link in, I know that when I attended the first meeting, I heard that there was a process that was put into place to streamline how you would do work as committees, and that was broken out into subcommittees.
Yes.
And are you able to identify, I think I have those here, education, health, policy, outreach, and engagement? Can you touch a little bit on each of those individual areas and how you're thinking about them as you put them together?
Yeah, so what I'll do is I'll share a little bit of a document that we shared yesterday, that I shared yesterday in the actual reparations committee meeting. And so basically each of the subcommittees will be expected to have their report ready come December as well. But part of what we've been doing is working on these updates and what that engagement would be. And so there is the education, the economic, the policy, the health committees that are currently existing. And so some of what all of those committees will be expected and required to do is to document the history. And so look at within their different areas and focus what's the history of racism and make the case really for reparations. And so we've asked them to review and look at some of these different reports that have come out. And so, they'll look at racial segregation in the San Francisco Bay Area, which is a report by the Belonging and Othering Institute at UC Berkeley, run by John Powell, which really looks at what has happened historically to Black folks in the San Francisco Bay Area. There's this map that looks at the decline of the Black population in the Bay Area. So they'll be asked to kind of look at all these and make the case and historically for that. And then we have additional reports, that range from the school desegregation consent decree that happened in San Francisco. and then just really documenting the continuing harm. And then they'll look at additional research and make the case and do those things. And then outreach plan, looking at other questions and things that they need to be asking. And then the subcommittees ultimately shared out the purpose, the objectives, and the outcomes, as well as the impact of what they think their recommendations would make and why those recommendations are being made. So each of them now have started that process to kind of document and begin to build out and do that work. And then they'll also share their timeline. So that's kind of the beginning framework and structure of what that will look like as we move some of that work forward. And like, I'll share with you here this one, just to give an example. I'll share the education subcommittees kind of beginning thoughts and one pager, right? So they have their purpose, they've highlighted the research, highlighted the focus, and then outlined their objectives that they hope to achieve, and then as well as the outcomes and what their outreach plan would be. So each one of the subcommittees will have a document like that that will then be kind of their kind of roadmap to moving this work forward.
Great. I know there's also been a lot of talk about the displacement of peoples from the Fillmore, Bayview, Hunters Point. How will that particular committee's research have an impact? And I know there was initially some talk about preserving the Heritage Center as low-hanging fruit.
Yeah, I mean, let's see, I want to go back to, so yesterday we also talked about, in that sense, these culturally affirming spaces. I think there were a couple of things that I've really been pushing and wanting to highlight. First and foremost is that, folks made some comparisons to the Fillmore Heritage Center, to the Asian Art Museum, and thought that there had been similar strategies. And the Asian Art Museum is actually still technically owned by the city and county of San Francisco. So folks thought that that it wasn't, and that it had been sold for $1 and wanted the Heritage Center to be sold similarly. That's not true, that the city still owns that. And there's also another piece around this that I've really just been asking people to take some time and look at. First and foremost is this, the declining of the Black population is one thing, but then also just understanding, these are communities and neighborhoods that have more than 10% Black people that live in them. And so Hayes Valley and the Western Addition both have, over 10%. And for a lot of folks, they're considered still the Fillmore all in one, the two, even though they've been split up. But that, we don't want to forget, as we talk about the Fillmore Western Addition, as we talk about the Western Addition project areas, there was a lot of promises made in terms of the Fillmore Western Addition. The Fillmore Heritage Center is one space within that A2 area, as it was called, A1, A2, which included Japantown, as well as what was formerly known as Harlem of the West, because they had so much rich Black businesses and so many rich cultural traditions, and artists were coming in during that time. And so the Fillmore Center, which is across the street from the Heritage Center, was supposed to be a space that was supposed to house the Black culture, the Negro Cultural Center, it was called. There were some promises with the other buildings along the other side of the street. And so we just want to make sure that folks are not only focused on one building. When that whole corridor, that whole Fillmore Street used to be like Black owned, Black run, Black operated. And we don't want folks to be distracted from what it looks like to create a community of Black businesses or Black leadership, and versus a building that represents that. So Fillmore Heritage Center is definitely part of the conversation, but really asking people to expand their minds and their thoughts around what it could look like to revitalize that corridor, but then also to not lose sight of, right, like the Bayview Hunters Point, to not shift and lose sight of 3rd Street, to not lose sight of Lakeview, OMI areas. Again, these are places that were rich with Black culture and tradition that in some ways have not been able to hold on to that. And so part of this is like, how do we make sure that we don't try to pigeonhole what is a Black space and what is a Black community, and also not get into this, some, you know, I know Reverend Brown told us last night, well, you know, there's North Beach and there's Chinatown, and that, you know, there are neighborhoods that are there, but those neighborhoods are bigger than one entity or one building in those spaces. And at the same time, we do not want to ignore where folks are, because we want them to feel welcome in whatever neighborhood they're in the city of San Francisco. So, you know, we've building some of this out, thinking about out migration versus in migration, and trying to do a little bit more with those conversations around space, where we're prioritizing space and where we're rolling up our sleeves and fighting.
Right, and then how does that impact the conversation around economic stability and gentrification and infrastructure, as you're thinking about that particular sequence of holistic approach to communities and neighborhoods?
So, I mean, I think the challenge here is that this committee is actually not the implementation committee, right? Like, it is the recommendation body. And so I think part of that is, and that's why I say, you know, I know folks are saying 2 years sounds like a long time, but not a lot of opposition to the idea and the theory of it, but where's the money going to come from, right? Like, and how much money? So I think that there's a lot, you know, I've been introduced to this word on numerous occasions over the last few months, forensic accounting, right? Like, there's a whole lot more to unpack. There's these conversations about who gets the money, right? And then, you know, do you have to be in San Francisco for your whole life or just a day in order to get reparations? Like, there's a whole lot of unpacking that needs to happen there. And so I think that process is a part of it. And that's where this infrastructure and like, who's leading that? And, you know, right now the committee is made up of volunteers, right? So they get a small stipend for their time, but the act of engaging people, the act of doing the research, yeah, the research has been done on the harm. The research hasn't necessarily been done on like how much harm has been done. And if you have to put a price to that, what's the price? Do we just arbitrarily say we're going to give everybody, you know, $50,000? Is this, you know, we've got $10 million to work with, like, what's the amount? And then once you find an amount, you land on an amount, where does that money come from? Right? Like, those are the things that we're having the conversations about, because the recommendation isn't just to do reparations, but it's about what does that actually look like? And do we say that the folks who were pushed out of the film, or the people who maybe eminent domain took their homes, do their families get additional money? Do we now need to go back and find all the businesses that were pushed out and say that if you had a business and a home, you get additional money? So I think it's a lot more complicated than we might think, because yes, we want to move this forward, but there's, you know, we've gone from, you know, 96,000 Black people to 40,000 Black people. Then, you know, do the 96,000 that were here 40 years ago, 60 years ago, do their descendants partake in this, even though they maybe don't live in the city anymore? I think there's a lot of that to be done. And the question is, how do we do all of that? Because there's a cost to that too. Putting an account, you know, quantifying that is, are we hiring consultants to do that? Because it's not necessarily the bandwidth of the committee members. And when you start talking about pulling millions of dollars from the city budget, you are going to need to, like, there's not going to be tremendous, I don't think there'll be the amount of support that folks think, right? Like, I think that there'll be considerable amount of opposition if you say you want to take, you know, $300 million and give it to Black people in the name of reparations. So there's also some level of marketing or a campaign or information that needs to be done. And there's also the question of political will. 2 years from now, we may not have the same folks in office with the same commitment, or we might be in a different landscape than we were last year with, you know, with George Floyd and Breonna Taylor. So, you know, there's a lot of questions about infrastructure, and I know the chair, Eric McDonald, is on listening in. And you know, he's been asking, and he's been saying, like, what does it look like for us to to make sure that we're putting some resources to the side exactly for infrastructure, right? Exactly to start to model and to build up. And I do think that there's some learning that we're hoping to gain from the Dreamkeeper initiative by what does it take to get the money out the door? How are we measuring impact? How are we knowing who's actually benefiting from those dollars? And hopefully that will inform in some way the conversation around infrastructure.
So you mentioned that you already have 150 million to start this year with.
So $120 million for the Dreamkeeper initiative, right, which can inform the reparations process. But I think, I've been really trying to have people understand and make the distinction that what makes this different than the reparations piece is that this is about investing in Black programs and Black initiatives, whereas reparations could very much be, here's your check, right? Like here's your money, versus where the Dreamkeeper initiative is about, well, we put this money towards home ownership programs. We put this much money towards job training programs, right? This much toward guaranteed income. So I think that there's some room there to learn, but it's not a direct replication of reparations, right? Like it is an investment in Black folks. It is $120 million that at the end of it, we can at least look back and say, what was the infrastructure? What was lacking? What should we have had? Where were the gaps? And where were the system failures?
And can you also, I don't know if you touched on this, say how that was funded, the Dreamkeepers Act?
So initially the first year, that was a reallocation of law enforcement dollars. So it came from the sheriff, the police department, the district attorney's office. It has now, because it is annualized, is not necessarily coming from any particular budget, because now it has been $60 million a year has been annualized into the mayor's budget. And so that was approved by, for next fiscal year, that was approved by the Board of Supervisors in their 2-year budget process.
And can you talk a little bit about how the research that you're doing to get your committee set up is being informed by things that are happening, like say in North Carolina or Evanston, Illinois, or different cities who are also undergoing this investigative process?
It's interesting because, we, San Francisco likes to be innovative. And, I think we've really struggled with how much we're going to learn and glean from other spaces and places. And so, yeah, definitely reaching out and want to have conversations with Evanston and other places. But, I will say we've invited some subject matter experts in, and, folks were like, we don't need you to tell us what to do. We're San Francisco, we're going to do this ourselves. But I think that there is a lot to be learned from folks who have gone through this process. And yes, it may be very different in other places where they've pretty much already said, like, this is the amount, and just kind of made that decision to move it forward. So yes, the plan is to continue to look at and learn from what's happening in other places while allowing San Francisco to be autonomous and innovative and, forward thinking as they develop their plan.
Great. And that's on more of a national level, but then thinking about going from directly in city and county of San Francisco, and then the ripples of the bedroom neighborhoods and communities that are around us, and then outward to the greater California. What do you think is going to be the long-term implications of San Francisco leading the way for the state of California? And how does that impact what's happening in the House and the Senate? Is it that this investigation is going to inform whatever bills are put forward?
I mean, it's interesting because, the governor also launched the California State Reparations Task Force. And, we've got Reverend Brown, who's on the statewide as well as the local. I think what makes us unique in this kind of work that we're doing is that we do have this parallel program that's happening where we can get some real learning. And I'm hoping that as we do this, that we're documenting, that we're collecting data, that we're looking at that information. And unlike some of the other initiatives, we're going to be able to really make some recommendations that are based in evidence practices versus just kind of recommendations based on theory. The other piece of this that is huge and is this idea that as we build this out, we've got to be really intentional, because the challenge is that there are so many people that still consider San Francisco home, but they've been pushed out of San Francisco. I was talking to somebody today who's like 5th generation San Franciscan, and they were saying that they live in Oakland because they couldn't afford to live in the city anymore. And so how are we going to address the folks who've been pushed to Oakland and Richmond and Antioch and Brentwood who still consider this home? And we want to really not penalize people for that. So it's going to require us to really use a regional approach to think about those neighboring communities, and really more than neighboring, they are just part of us, right? Like we're really connected, and that there are so many people that maybe spend 8 hours of their 24 hours sleeping somewhere else, but they spend all of their waking moments here or getting here to San Francisco. And I think that that is going to really have us think about how we inform and are able to share some of our learnings with the statewide initiative, where they have folks coming from around the state. But here we are, we're doing this, and we're going to understand how it impacts people that live here, or people that visit here, or people that work here. And how do we make sure that we're not alienating somebody that's got, you know, a history of being connected to San Francisco, but that when we talk about reparations, they've been locked out. And I think that's the other piece when we talk about this process that we really do have to figure out, because when we talk about 57 years ago, you know, or 60 years ago, you know, or 80 years ago when redevelopment came in with their urban renewal plan, and they actually were, you know, just removing Black folks left and right. Like, how do we address that? And the folks that, you know, never recovered or were able to come back.
Right. And then also in thinking about the changing demographics of looking at census data and all of that, and who gets to identify as African American, what has been the tenor of those conversations? And then also for those who really feel beholden to the fact that if you are of Latin Caribbean, Afro-Caribbean or Afro-Latino descent, that is part of the conversation. I know there's been a very stern breakdown specifically about those indigenous to the United States, but that's really not who we have anymore in this area. How is that coming up in conversation?
Well, it's interesting when you look at statistics that talk about, you know, there are more people who identify as multiracial in the country today. I think there are a couple different things, right? And I think this is the hard part. And this is where, again, there's going to have to be some drill down on these conversations. Are we talking about, like the Dreamkeeper initiative is focused on the Black community, right? Like those funds are for Black folks. And we've heard from African immigrants and the African Immigrant Network that, you know, when they're walking down the street, people may or may not identify them as African, but they see them as Black. And so that initial anti-Blackness is real for them. So the Dreamkeeper initiative is very much focused on Blackness. I think the idea and notion and the definition of reparations in the truest sense is this idea that it's reparations for slavery. And so if it is reparations for slavery, that is going to change who can have access to those dollars. And I think that's the hard conversation that we move through. This is a conversation about reparations for slavery, not around reparations for anti-Blackness, which is a different conversation. And I think that's the other piece that makes this challenging for the recommendations, because that case is going to have to be made, and somebody's going to have to like stand up and say, this is the plan. That's what, you know, when you look at and we pay attention to some of the areas that are required in the actual areas of for reparations, and why we're doing that, what we're doing, like some of the things in there say very specifically chattel slavery, right? It talks about documenting that. So that's why I think it's going to be a challenge and really hard for folks to navigate and move through, because it's not about anti-Blackness. It is about, when we look at this, chronicles the legacy of American chattel slavery, post-Civil War, government-sanctioned discrimination. Like, that's the first piece of that, right? And then the rest of it, yeah, we get to this other piece, which is less about the slavery component, but that this first piece of it, the first call out is the reparations plan is supposed to chronicle the legacy and address that. And that's the other piece around, determines the scope and eligibility and what's the truest intent. And so if the truest intent is to address the harm done by slavery, then that's going to limit some of the folks who may not be descendants of slaves.
Right. And then it really also, then you bring up a great point about documentation and how did we get there? And then how do we also, in that process, as more cities and states move towards reparation, going against the monetization of how you get that documentation. Companies like Ancestry or 23andMe, how do we make sure that people have access to be able to claim their ancestry without having to commit to that amount of funding out of their own pockets?
Yeah, I mean, I think that that's, again, where we leverage projects like the Dreamkeeper Initiative, but also that scope and eligibility, or what does reparations look like? So part of it might be, I mean, when we talk about addressing the harm of slavery, right, off top, what you're talking about is, we only can, and I say we because, I know that I'm the descendant of slaves, and I know that when I do ancestry.com, that I hit a certain point where there are no records, right? Where all I can see is one side of something, and I can't see who her parents were. I can't see what lineage she came from, because it wasn't documented. And even when we go back through and look at the census itself, like one year they were categorized as one race, another year they were categorized, another decade as something else. One decade somebody couldn't even sign their own name, right? They just had to X, and then the census worker, the poll, wrote their name out. So there's so many pieces to this that have to be really unpacked. And I think part of the reparations is, how do we do this documentation? I used to watch that show, the Henry Louis Gates show that, kind of goes back and helps people find out where they come from. Like, that cost a lot. They were doing that with celebrities. What's the cost to actually help somebody maybe go back and go through the archives, and not even just for the point of getting reparations, but just to be able to know who you are, to know where you come from, to have that story. I think that's another potential place to invest money, right, to pay folks for. And I think, the other piece of that is, there was, a Black ancestry company, right? Like, what does it look like to invest or partner with them, or to think about how to do that type of tracking and tracing and understanding who we are, and not to have the narrative with a different lens on it.
Absolutely. Well, Freddie also brings up a good point where he is asking about those who are incarcerated, who we can't get to. And we know that many of the reasons that so many of us are incarcerated is because of all of the social injustices and policies that have been put into place. Has that just come up in this discussion, as far as is that one of the rights that previously and currently incarcerated people will they have access?
Well, I mean, that's part of the process for the Reparations Advisory Committee. And that's why I would say, we're pushing them to go out and to connect with folks, and we're inviting people to attend and participate in those meetings, because the reality of it is, when we look at San Francisco, the current census has the Black population of 5.6%, but we know that the population of those incarcerated, that it's almost 50% of those incarcerated are Black, right? So there's a huge disproportionality in terms of who's incarcerated versus who lives in the city. And so off top, we know that there has to be some investment there. And there is some level of, unless we're trying to say one group is inherently bad, or that they are more prone to do bad things than others, then we have to admit that there's some kind of systems failure, or there's some type of injustice that's being served out to Black folks in terms of that, or more that the system that we operate or the world that we live in is creating this thing, whether it's the school to prison pipeline or whether it is over policing, there's a mismatch there, and that we need to address some of that. So off top there, we've already started, even with the Dreamkeeper initiative, to allocate funds to be able to support formerly incarcerated people, right? And to also think about, the resources. We're doing things right now where we've been giving books and trying to get workshops, and we're working with the City Build program to get folks who are currently incarcerated training and workshops to be able to get jobs when they get out. So I think that investment is critical to this. But I think more than that is understanding the whole continuum of that prison pipeline, right? What's happening before someone gets incarcerated and what we're doing after they're incarcerated, as well as while they're incarcerated. And so what does that look like in terms of reparations? The idea is that being incarcerated should not keep you from getting access to the funds that are being set up to address the harm that's been done. And the question that I would offer is that if we find that in some ways what's happened is there, some additional redress for folks who have been, wrongfully accused or, negatively impacted by the system.
Absolutely. Oh gosh, my question just slipped my mind. Oh, if you have more questions, go ahead and put them in the chat. What's the question I just had? I should have written it down. I know I should have written it down. But I know what it was. For those people who are interested in the possibility, is there a way that an individual with an organization or a group can apply for Dreamkeeper funds?
Yeah, so I am going to let me just pull that up. I had just had that in the chat. There is a Dreamkeeper meeting this week on Thursday. And in that meeting, we will talk about mini grants that are coming out and ways that organizations that are interested can apply for those funds. And then we'll continue to have additional meetings so if you email, let me just pull up that email address too. If you email Dreamkeeper SF, if you email that, we can add you to the email list so that you can get updates on the information. But you can also visit the dreamkeepersf.org website to be able to kind of follow up and see what's going on with that work. But yes, I put that in the chat, and we'll have a meeting this week where we'll talk a little bit about the upcoming opportunities for folks to access resources from the Dreamkeeper initiative. And then I will put the email address for the Dreamkeeper initiative in the chat as well for folks who want to email or ask to be on the list.
So with our group, I know most of our racial justice group identify as white anti-racist, and we have a large contingency at GLIDE of allies and accomplices that work with us. And we started out with reading The Color of Law by Richard Rothstein to really educate ourselves a little bit more about the landscape, and then also in connecting with your group. What could other white anti-racists or allies or accomplices do as part of the work in helping to help Black people achieve reparations? What should they be doing?
I mean, I think one of the things that's really important is how do we socialize the idea of reparations as okay, right? I think that, definitely there's been more movement around guaranteed income and now around the conversations of reparations. I would say the challenge is going to be actually moving it from an idea and a thought to reality. That is going to be key. And I would say, I appreciate the language around accomplices, like that we're going to need people to actually who aren't going to directly benefit, right? Although I would argue that everybody benefits from reparations, right? As we are investing and supporting and building up communities. And as we are doing, as we are repenting, right, for the wrongs that have been done, right, that it's kind of like pruning and being able to grow anew, that everybody benefits from that. The garden will grow and be that much more beautiful. But that we're going to need people who don't financially immediately benefit from reparations to say it's a good thing, because folks will find a way to knock that down. So it's speaking up on behalf of reparations. It's being in the meetings and engaging in conversations around reparations. It is when it comes time to campaign and get folks to realize that, because in a city like San Francisco, where less than 6% of the population is Black, that may or may not be enough to sway a vote, right? Like if it's something that comes to a vote, where politicians might be worried about whether they're going to lose constituents or votes because of the stance that they take on that. We're going to need folks that, make up a wider population of folks to stand up and say this is important, so that it doesn't get dismissed. And I would just say we also need thought partners.
And then that brings to mind for me also the conservative Black voices that are out there who have that privilege and mentality around pulling yourself up by your bootstraps and making your own dollar, and that we don't need reparations. How has that conversation been impacting the work that you're doing, or how have you seen it impact in other places?
I mean, we've been doing, I've been having some conversations with Derek Hamilton and other folks who are leading some of the conversations around reparations and guaranteed income on a national level. And, that those conversations are going to continue. Much like what we've seen happen with Prop 209 here in the Bay Area and in the state. It's going to be a challenge, and it's definitely going to be a fight. And I would just say to folks who believe that it's not going to be a fight, again, let's look at what happened with the vote to overturn 209, right? Where everybody thought we had the votes and they thought it was going to overturn, and they thought that we were going to be able to have these conversations, that it didn't.
And can you define 209?
209 was which is basically saying that you can't talk about race, right? So it took away affirmative action in the colleges. It takes away the ability to say, we want to prioritize and center and trying to get people of color into certain positions or opportunities because of that very conservative thought that you mentioned, where folks are like, we don't need handouts and we don't need people doing special favors for folks, when that's really not at all what it is. It really is this idea of addressing and owning the harm. And I think that the challenge here is that when we say, pull yourself up by your bootstraps, folks sometimes will say, well, some people don't have boots. And, I've heard some people say, and then there's some people who are even, don't even have legs to walk at this point in time. Like, so what are we doing to really own and admit that, like, the system has failed? Right? Like this idea that, you have to have a certain GPA or you have to have a certain skill set to get into an internship. But if I'm in a school that never taught me that skill, or that I never had a chance to take that class, or I didn't have a tutor and I didn't understand how to do that work, it's not really a fair shot at doing this work, right? If I'm in a school where, I never had an opportunity to gain that experience, then it's not really fair to say I should have done X, Y, and Z to get to this point. And so I think that those are the challenges, is that we do have to, as Eric has shared in the chat, we do have to really think about what is this multiracial coalition, but beyond that, that's creating the political will. We have to create the narrative. Right. And we have not successfully created that narrative that hits across the state, and that hits all those pockets, and that hits the people that, that we don't know how they voted, because clearly California is still not ready for the true conversation around racial inequity, or some of the things that we want to see happen would be happening, and we wouldn't be trying to figure out the campaign to overturn certain things. So I would just say that we still got to work on that language. We still got to work on that narrative and figure out what the thing is that convinces people, because as people often say, we are singing to the choir, and we have not yet figured out how to like not sound off key to some other folks, right? Like we're singing old school gospel, and folks are looking for an opera, and they're saying we're singing it wrong. So we got to figure it out, because we're in the wrong choir right now.
Right. And I'm piecing together some of the things that are coming up in the chat and thinking about this outreach and engagement. And as individuals, we have the ability to do, but I know that oftentimes how we stumble is not knowing what's the container in which we are talking about, and thinking about who are all the other oppressed groups, and what is the messaging that goes out to those groups that helps them to understand not only that everybody's going to benefit from Blacks having their reparations, but then also that they have their own work to do. It's separate.
Yeah.
And so will there be some sort of artifact or document that will come out that will help us as Black leaders, Black citizens, and allies and so forth, to be able to have healthy conversations and critical conversations around that?
Yeah, I mean, there's, I mentioned earlier the Human Rights Commission has this weekly roundtable, which is this collection of all of a bunch of different diverse stakeholders. And we have, over the last, year plus, been dealing with, as some folks refer to it to me, whataboutism, right? That, we go into these spaces and other groups are like, what about us? What about us? What about us? And that we're not really understanding how our collective liberation is tied to our solidarity at the same time. And that, we don't want to be fragmented. We don't want to be fractured. And, we're leading some of that. We have an initiative called Stand Together SF, which is the campaign for solidarity, which we are doing some of that meeting and convening and having those hard conversations. I think the challenge here is to have those hard conversations, right? And to be willing to be uncomfortable and being willing to be versatile. I'm looking at Tom's comment in the chat, because, I like to think about, the talent that was Aretha Franklin, right? And that Aretha Franklin was singing gospel, and then she was singing R&B, and then, she blew everybody's mind when she sang Ave Maria, right? So that we do need to be able to be in multiple genres of this music and of this song and of this singing. And we have to be willing to let somebody else be the soloist, right? Like we have to be willing to be backup singers sometime in this process. And that's a hard conversation, right? It's kind of when somebody goes solo in these groups, and, somebody has to be the backup, and sometimes we get left behind, and we've got to figure out how to do that without saying, well, we're going to shut the whole industry down if it's not just me leading the way.
And do you foresee this being part of a larger, or maybe the outcome moving in towards larger protests, depending on the success or failure of this investigation?
I mean, I will tell you, more than the reparations recommendations, I'm more concerned about the actual dollars that are out. Because I do feel, I am very concerned about the scrutiny and the using, how the dollars are used, or whether they have impact, or whether they have significant outcomes in the first 6 months to a year to justify whether the funding should continue or not, whether there should be reparations or not. I think an initiative that is focused on Black people, that is led by a department that's led by a Black woman, and the money was allocated by a Black mayor and a Black supervisor. Already, I mean, I can't even begin to tell you the barriers and the bureaucracies and the structural problems that I have had to navigate just to move the dollars, right? And my perception that I've shared with folks is that, you know, I don't think that it's happening to anybody that doesn't look like me. I think other people are able to move that money along a little bit easier. There was a story last week about us potentially giving money to folks who were at high risk of being involved in violent crime, right? Engaging them in a program and giving them money. And then the next thing I know, it was like cash for criminals, that we're going to give money to cash for criminals. And I was paying people not to shoot people. And this whole narrative took on a life of its own that didn't anywhere like touch on what was the heart of a program that was about preventing violence, that was about saving lives, that it was about investing in people to be able to transform not just their lives, but communities. And it took on a life of its own. And so I'm so super committed to centering community voice. I'm so committed to data collection and data analysis. But I think it's unfair and unrealistic to think that we're going to change graduation rates or we're going to change academic achievement outcomes in a year because we gave some money to some Black folks, right? Like I think that there is some undue pressure on the folks that are going to be getting these funds. I think it's some undue pressure on the folks that are going to be overseeing it. And not the same kind of scrutiny and pressure in other spaces and places. And so I'm very concerned that what happens with the Dreamkeeper dollars will be used to determine or define whether Black people are worthy of resources in this town. Nothing to say about the fact that, you know, this Black people have been failed, right? Whether it's represented in the health disparities that we see, whether it's represented in the incarceration rates, whether it is represented in the homelessness rates, right? Again, less than 6% of the population is Black, but nearly 40% of the folks are that are homeless are Black. And yet, you know, there's not a sense of urgency to like address or talk about what is happening there. And I think, you know, I really appreciate that comment, RJ, because I do hope folks can see that it's longitudinal, right? That we can make a commitment to some long-term, what it looks like to have the population growth level change that folks want to see, but that we initially, you know, look, I will tell you, my big plus is if we can, in the next year, actually come to some agreement about what metrics and outcomes we're going to use that are more than a sign-in sheet, right? And that we can be in agreement that the information that we collect through the Dreamkeeper initiative, people aren't going to be penalized for their numbers, but that we're going to look at those numbers and understand why, if you had the capacity to serve 100, you only served 60, right? And that maybe it costs that much to serve 60 people well. And so instead of taking money away from you, so that now instead of serving 60, you can only serve 20, like, let's be realistic and let's be honest about like what we want to achieve and why we want to achieve it. And I think that's my goal, is if we can at least get to understanding and measuring what real impact is and being able to be accountable for what it is that we want, right? Like if this first thing is just about like seeing and validating and listening to the Black community and investing in community-led strategies, then let's do that. But do I think it's fair to say a year from now, it didn't work, we're taking your money? Because how many years has the city had, or has this country had, to do right by Black folks and has not done it? But, you know, they continue to just do it the way that they want to without any input from the folks with lived experience.
Right. That is so true. And I had to smile when you started to list who is in charge of this initiative, because I kind of knew, okay, Black mayor, Black committee chair, but I had not like really thought of it as a complete team. And as such, as you are doing this work, you've kind of touched on this a little bit, and also as we are doing the work in tandem as community organizations, there will bound to be missteps. And how do you see, if we are to make a misstep, as say the Glide Racial Justice Group, to come out of pocket with some idea or things like that, how can we make repair and keep going?
I mean, I think that that's the hard part, right? I think the only time I hear about it is in science or tech, when people are like okay with making a mistake and talking about like we learned from that. Like we say that anecdotally, you learn from your mistake, but people are so concerned and I guess I would say afraid in this kind of racially charged era to say or do something wrong, right? And so, and then when we do, we're afraid to like own it. And so I was on a call earlier today with some folks and they were like, well, well, what do we do? Let's cancel this thing because, we're not ready. And I said, well, I'd rather just admit that I wasn't ready or that I dropped the ball or that I didn't do something and model what it is that we want to see happen. And so I think that that's the number one thing, is to model it, right? When you make that mistake, be honest, be sincere, come and say like, we had a misstep. Like, can we fix this? What can we do? And be ready for folks to maybe not be willing at that point in time to forgive. I think the hardest part of all of this is building trust. And to not make it look like, we're just doing that because that's what's trending right now. Social justice is trending right now. Racial equity is trending right now. And so you've got to build trust. And in order to build trust, that means when people tell you to go away, that you respect those boundaries, but you still make yourself available and you say, right, like you have to prove that you're there for the right reason and build trust. And part of that is coming, not asking for anything initially, right? Just being there, being available. And sometimes even when you ask people, what is it? I don't know how many folks have worked with volunteers, and sometimes having volunteers is actually more work than, because you've got to make up the plan, you've got to spell it all out, you've got to do X, Y, and Z, and sometimes it's easier to just do the work yourself. And so being in space, building trust, being observant, and kind of seeing where people may potentially need help, building those relationships, I think is going to be critical and key. Because right now a lot of folks are concerned that people are just coming out because there's money coming, and why do they really want to help? And they weren't helping before, and they didn't even speak to me the last time I saw them. So making sure that the relationships and the conversations and all those things are intact, so that people aren't questioning motive.
All right, I have a couple more questions for you before we start to wrap up. And if you have anything that you haven't put into the chat yet, please feel free to do so at this time. What is the connection between privatized funds coming into the pipeline for reparations? Has that started to be discussed at all, or is it all money that we have to find through the city budget?
So right now it hasn't been defined, right? Like, so that's again part of this conversation. There's $100 million fund that's been done by philanthropic across the state. $100 million commitment. They are still raising the money. How they're going to use that or what they're going to use that for, that's a place to tap into. I don't know if folks have seen all the different kind of articles that have come out and said, all these people made commitments during Breonna Taylor and George Floyd, and all these corporate places said they were going to invest in Black communities, they were going to do this give back, and that it hasn't actually materialized, right? And then there has been a push to have conversations with, in years past, folks that were participating in slave trade or that were actively involved in discriminatory practices, whether that's the banks that did redlining, whether that is folks that were doing the railroad lines and all of these other things that were, cotton industry, all these folks that made money, right, off of the backs of slavery, right? Do you go after those companies? I think that those are all the conversations, again, when we start to get into the weeds of what it is that the Reparations Advisory Committee should be looking at. Those are the questions, right? who are those industries that, maybe perpetuated slavery, and, those families or those organizations made money off of it. I was looking the other day, I noticed, and it's, again, how far do you go? Is it just about actual slavery or off the imagery of it? I was looking at a commercial the other day, and I was like, Pearl something company. And I'm like, oh, Aunt Jemima, that's right. I forgot Aunt Jemima is no longer Aunt Jemima. They changed the name, and they removed the image, but they had this, it's Pearl Mills something company, right?
Yeah.
And so, Uncle Ben's, right? Like all of these different things that the imagery made folks think about slavery, right? And that it was perpetuating a stereotype or a norm. And do you say that there was some level of money made off of the identity of slaves, or because Uncle Ben and Aunt Jemima didn't make no money off of that, right? So fiction or not fiction, but like, what is it based off of, right? Those are the conversations too. But that there was something that was building trust to say, oh, these Black folks knew how to cook, right? Like, so we're going to put their image on our boxes.
Which I think they only pay them like $20 or $50, something like that for, yeah.
Yeah.
For sure. So I'm wondering, this is for the future. What should we be doing as Black people to prepare ourselves in advance and our communities for how we will develop and spend our reparations? Like, what could we be doing to prepare ourselves?
I mean, I think there are a lot of things. Dale just hit it too. I think one of the things is, how do we make sure that this equity and reparations conversation doesn't go out of style? So I would say, the further we get away from the protest of the last year's summers, the easier it's going to be for folks to forget why this stuff was important. And so as we think about it, that's my first comment that I just want to say, like, I say that all the time, that it's not going to be trending, but I would say if folks want to be helpful, like, let's make sure this continues to trend, right? Let's make sure that social justice and addressing inequity does not go out of style, that it does not become a thing of the past. I had this conversation with a couple years ago with some folks. John Burris was on this panel, as well as some folks that had been doing work around reparations. And I had asked this question, being facetious, but totally serious. I was asking a question about, what were we going to do around reparations? Because I immediately had this flashback to, I don't know how many people have watched the Dave Chappelle show. And so I had this flashback to, there was a sketch on the Dave Chappelle show where reparations came out and all the Black people were given their money. And the sketch had, people going out buying Cadillacs and buying, Old English 800. And like, so, it was a parody on, people's fears of what will happen if Black people just get access to a lot of money. And I asked the panel, I said, what do you think about this idea that Black folks get this money and they go and do whatever they want to with it? And, there was a lot of different responses. One person was like, look, I've seen it. I've given, we've won cases and we've given money, and all of a sudden these people who had little to no money have millions of dollars. And, they go out and, there was an example of somebody that went out and bought a car and then had a really fancy, high-powered car and then had an accident. And he's like, was that a good use of the funds? I don't know. He had an accident. He was badly injured, and, all of these other things happened. And then he ended up having to spend his money on, medical bills. Mm-hmm. And another person said, it's their money, right? And that we need to let folks do what they want to. Not saying that we shouldn't be having financial coaches and doing financial literacy, but that it's their money. And that this is part of the problem. And that's basically what happened with slavery. Black folks didn't get their money. They didn't get to access and use the money that the way that they wanted to. And that their rights were taken away from them. And that ultimately, yes, we should be doing something to build the capacity and knowledge and awareness for folks. But that at the end of the day, if the overall system works right, we don't have to worry about that, right? But that people shouldn't be micromanaged, and we shouldn't be telling them what to do with their money. And so I guess the question is, how are we helping people as we prepare for that? What's in place for folks, and for folks that want it? Yeah, sure, folks can be encouraged to invest. Folks can be encouraged to buy homes and to use their money right, however that might be defined, but that ultimately every individual and household should be able to decide what's right for them.
Thank you. My last question, and well, there's one other question I saw in the chat before I go to the last one. Are there funds for the committee to get financial experts involved in the work?
Yes, so we, again, this is something that the chair, Eric McDonald, specifically asked about. And so we had already resources allocated to support the Reparations Advisory Committee. And so what we're hoping is that people will tell us what those needs are. Folks have talked about forensic accounting. They've talked about marketing and campaigns. They've talked about research. And so, yes, there will be resources to support and get folks in. We're also talking with some academic institutions, trying to think about and ask them to think about what we should be doing and make some recommendations. And I think that ultimately the Board of Supervisors and the mayor's office would love to have that kind of expertise that talks about, the distribution, but also how we're making assessments of where to pull that money from.
Okay, thank you. And last question. I know that you've already kind of touched on this, but as far as the impact as we move along, I know Mary Frances Winters of the Winters Group talks a lot about Black fatigue, how it impacts our education, our ability to access education, it impacts healthcare, all of these things that cumulatively and then also generationally show up for us. And then also on the white side, the white fatigue of stepping into the work, but then being able to put it down whenever you feel overwhelmed or feeling like you can't engage. What's your best advice for self-care as you go through and stick with this work?
I don't know if I'm the best person to say that. I was on a call earlier today and I was like, So, I had been really trying to work on it. And, I'm going to go back to, I think it was Tom that put it in the chat earlier about like singing and all this other stuff. I would say for me that people really do need to figure out what speaks to their soul, what encourages their heart, and what's that affirmation that you give yourself, right? And this is where, for me, my Black experience, right, it grounds me. It helps me in those moments. Like I started with the Langston Hughes poem. Like in those moments when I'm feeling really defeated, I go back to my Black History Month poetry, where I'm like, pretty women wonder where my secret lies. See, I'm not cute or built to suit a fashion model size. But when I try to tell them, they think I'm telling lies. Right? I go back to, in those moments of insecurity and tiredness, I go back to my mother's look at me on a Sunday morning, where I better learn that Maya Angelou poem and learn it right and be able to say it like I mean it. Like those things speak to me in those moments, right? I go to, that's what helps me. That's what calms me, right? When you think about it, I go to my grandmother, have you any rivers that feel uncrossable? I go to a song that, like, I'm just going to sing it to myself. I'm going to calm myself. I'm going to be okay. I go to those moments of, what, things can be better. I go to the intellect and the knowledge and the experience of the elders who didn't need science to tell them that meditation, whether you call it yoga or prayer, is good for your soul, right? It's good for your heart. And so those are the practices that folks have to figure out. You've got to figure out, you got to find that. And you have to take pause for that. Otherwise, the fatigue and the reality and the day-to-day will wear you out. And so I have been forcing myself. And so this is the other thing, like force yourself to take time, whether it is taking a walk, whether it is doodling, whether it is writing a note to yourself, whether it is reciting a scripture, trust in the Lord with all thine heart, lean, like whatever it is, whatever your thing is, find your thing and make sure that you carve out some time every day, even if it's only 5 minutes, but do something every day to affirm yourself, to celebrate yourself, and to allow yourself to be human. And without that, we are going to we're going to more than burn out, right? And I think you just have to take that pause. You have to figure out that thing, and you have to be committed to it.
Thank you. Thank you very much. And Ms. Lena says, we have to find some way to affirm our humanity and connection to a creator who loves us enough to print our souls. Amen. And thank you, Lena, for that. We at Glide will have opportunities for you to continue self-care. So if you enjoyed this program with Director Sheryl Davis, and then also with the Glide Racial Justice Group, we invite you to participate with us. We have several more groups at Glide that really promote self-care. Some promote spirituality, just empowerment and activism through the arts and speaking out. So I think Brant's going to put a link in the chat. We're going to be celebrating rebalancing, rebirth, and renewal during Solstice Week, the week of the 21st. So you can get involved with our yoga, meditation, white anti-racist group, racial justice group, and we'll be continuing this conversation, unpacking what we've just heard here today. So thank you very much for your time, Director Davis. And that will be it for the Glide Racial Justice Group for today. Take care, everyone, and have a great evening.
Thank you.